moving right along. Shayle Kann from Greentech Media, GTM Research, is here to give us a very quick snapshot on what's happening in the world of electricity startups. Not just at MIT, I presume.
That's right. Great. Thanks, Trond, and thanks everybody for coming. So I lead GTM Research, which is the market analysis and consulting arm of Greentech Media. So we are not a startup exactly. We're not exactly industrial either, but we pay a lot of attention to both, and particularly within electricity, particularly within the US, and looking at what trends are going on broadly within the sector and how that impacts innovation and startup activity. And I guess I personally think that right now is possibly a unique period in the sense that there are three big, broad macro transitions that are happening in electricity in the US, any of which individually would be notable, any of which individually would create significant opportunity for innovation, for startup activity. But the fact that all three of them are happening simultaneously creates this kind of perfect storm where the market is so dynamic and changing so quickly that there's both a ton of opportunity and it's all fraught with lots of risk. So those transitions are, first, decarbonization, right? We are transitioning from an electricity sector that is primarily based on fossil fuels to one that has at least some kind of meaningful share of renewable energy. Now, that's a transition that will take a long time. Obviously, it'll be impacted by the pace at which things like the Clean Power Plan are rolled out. But if you just look at the new electricity generation that is coming online in the US right now, you can see this is a transition that is real. For example, in 2015, we installed more solar capacity and more wind capacity individually than any other technology, more than natural gas, certainly more than coal, more than nuclear, more than anything else. So those are the top two new sources of generating capacity for electricity in the US. If you look at the solar sector, there's lots of metrics you can use to sort of make the argument that solar is real and solar is here. Anytime now, sometime between like a week ago and 2 weeks from now, we're going to hit 1 million individual solar installations in the US. We'll have 1 million solar projects operating every day. And, that was 7.3 gigawatts of solar last year. That's a fairly significant number. It'll take a long time for that to eat into the overall mix. But that's a big transition and obviously carries with it lots of opportunities for startup activity and for innovation. You can figure out better ways to deploy these technologies. You can figure out ways to make the technologies themselves cheaper, to lower things like customer acquisition costs that remain a really painful barrier still to particularly distributed solar. Obviously, plenty of opportunity around that transition on its own. Add to that then the second transition, which is decentralization, right? And it's not completely unrelated because you wouldn't really have this big decentralization trend if it weren't for things like rooftop solar, but it is an independent trend. And this is one in which we are moving from an electricity sector that since its inception has been designed off of a pretty straightforward unidirectional model that goes from, small number of large centralized generating plants through a transmission system, then a distribution system, to customers who are largely passive consumers, right? They would just consume power at the times when they need it, and they would pay for it. The one that we are moving toward now is one in which there is a significant degree of customer empowerment for the first part, which is to say that customers, as was just mentioned, and GE is actually a perfect example of this through what they're doing with Current, customers can generate their own electricity, they can manage their consumption more actively, potentially they can store their own electricity. All these things present lots of opportunities for the customer. They also present lots of opportunities for the network, right? You can make the whole system more efficient if this is managed effectively. You can make it more resilient, more reliable. But that is difficult to do, obviously, not just from moving to hundreds of millions of nodes, but also the management of that, the regulatory end of that. How do you redesign this electricity market such that it actually enables these things and puts them where they are most effective? So from an innovation standpoint, there's opportunity all over the place there. There's technology in both the resources themselves, the aggregation of those resources, the deployment and control of those resources. There's innovation on the business model side. How do you get these things to customers? How do you get multiple different things to a single customer? This is something that Current is trying to figure out for larger customers. It's a question for smaller customers as well. And then I think the thing that often is left out of these conversations, we spend a lot of time talking about the smaller side of this, what actually gets deployed at the customer's premises. But there's an entirely other set of technologies, processes, and software that has to get designed on the utility side of the meter, because the utility at the end of the day has to be managing the grid and integrating all of these resources. That is an enormous challenge for the utility and the grid operator, and one where there is a lot of opportunity and a much smaller number of startups today who are providing services to the utility to integrate and manage distributed energy resources. And then the final transition that I think is the one that's probably in its earliest stage, but also presents a really interesting opportunity over the long term, is vehicle electrification, right? And this is one that in some ways, if you're a utility, you're looking at vehicle electrification as a savior, because you've been facing low load growth or stagnant, in some cases even declining load growth for the past couple of decades. This is the first new major source of new electricity load that utilities can see. And even better than that, it's load that can be controlled. With the right price signals, the right market structure, the right regulation, you can charge electric vehicles primarily when the grid needs it most. You can use it for balancing. You can do two-way charging. This is also a regulatory and business model challenge that presents all sorts of opportunities. So those three things together, I think, are presenting a really interesting landscape. And the only sort of piece of advice that I have for startups that are trying to play within that, consider all three of those things together and then try to see around the corner as to how the market will evolve 5 or 10 years from now, because there's been a tendency to see the next year or two an opportunity that is immediate and in front of you right now. And I think in contrast to the past century for the electricity sector, this is now a sector that is changing day by day. And so it's important to look a little further ahead as you figure out exactly what you want to be doing to take advantage of that. Thank you.